Hi, I'm Carl Sweeney.
And I'm Raquel Stecher, and this is the CineHistorians podcast, where we explore the history of cinema from across the globe.
Welcome back, everybody, to the CineHistorians podcast. This is the latest episode in our series on new waves. I'm Carl Sweeney, and I'm joined as ever by my co-host Raquel Stecher. And Raquel, we have now reached our most recent cinematic movement chronologically. This is a 21st century movement of films known as the Greek Weird Wave. And in particular, we're going to focus on a 2009 film directed by Yorgos Lanthimos called Dogtooth. And Raquel, as you said in our last episode, this is very much shaping up to be the not safe for work episode of CineHistorians, isn't it? So are you ready for what's likely to be a shocking and provocative recording?
I am. I've been really excited for this episode, I think, ever since we started planning this season. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting one.
Right, it absolutely is. And just the way things have fallen, the task of describing the film in question falls to me this episode, which is an interesting one.
I'm so sorry.
I'll give it my best shot, absolutely. Before we get there, Raquel, you're going to help us set the scene about the Greek Weird Wave, some of the broader context around it. And like you said, I know you've been looking forward to this episode, so I'm looking forward to hear you sketch this out for us.
So Greek cinema begins at the very early days of filmmaking, the early 1900s, and it really picks up in the 1920s. And what we see over the 20th century is that the industry is very much influenced by political and economic turmoil. There's like the Greco-Turkish War, the Greek Civil War, the effects of World War II, authoritarianism, and then censorship. So this is an industry greatly affected with what is happening in the country. So once you get into the 1950s and 1960s, we enter the golden age of Greek cinema. You get films like Stella, Jules Dassin's Never on Sunday, Zorba the Greek with Anthony Quinn, who wasn't actually Greek, but that was a huge international success. And later you also get the critically acclaimed film Z by Costa Gavras. And there's a little bit of an influence in Italian neorealism, but what was happening in Europe at the time, this is like post World War II, there was this cultural boom happening. And there was a lot of international interest in Europe, particularly Italy, but also France and Greece. And there's this interest in these countries as tourist destinations, but also in their style and their culture and food, their celebrities and so on. So there's a lot of outside interest in films about Greece. But then you see this decline in the 1970s in the film industry, and then like a resurgence sort of after that. So we're going through, hills and troughs. And around that time, we enter the postmodern period. Eventually, like we get to what we're talking about today, the Greek Weird Wave, which takes us into the 21st century. And what you have to understand about the Greek Weird Wave is that it's really a response to the Greek debt crisis. And I won't go too much into detail about this because it gets kind of complicated, but what you should know is that in 2008, Greece enters this financial crisis, and it was several years in the making. It's a combination of like internal and external factors like deregulation, privatization, a reliance on debt that they couldn't eventually pay back. And then there was also just fallout of joining the European Union and adopting the euro. So you get to 2008 and Greece plunges into this debt crisis, and the ripple effects kind of continue for the next decade. And this causes like a humanitarian crisis. There's high unemployment rate, skyrocketing taxes, poverty, homelessness, has a profound effect on the people. And there's this sense that the government is failing the people. And this is a country in turmoil, and out of that turmoil comes this like cinematic response to what's going on, and we get the Greek Weird Wave. So the Greek Weird Wave kind of starts in like 2009, just after during the crisis. And the name actually comes from a article in The Guardian from August 2011, writer Steve Rose, called Attenborough, Dogtooth, and the Weird Wave of Greek Cinema. And what he noticed was just that there's some really strange films and interesting films coming out of Greece. And like other new waves, filmmakers in Greece were facing financial limitations. There's a lack of government funding. So a lot of these projects were low budget. Filmmakers were forced to find their own funding, make their own production companies, get international interest. But it also created this network of filmmakers and actors and other talent who were very collaborative. They all kind of worked with each other. And two big names in this movement are Athena Rachel Zangari, who directed Attenberg and Chevalier, and then Yorgos Lanthimos, who we're talking about today. And before he became a major Hollywood director, he got his start in his home country of Greece with films like Kineta and Alps, and the film we're talking about today, Dogtooth. And both Zangari and Lanthimos worked together on each other's films. Just before we go into Dogtooth, let's just go over a little bit of the characteristics of the Greek Weird Wave.
Yep.
These are high concept films. They're allegorical. There's the symbolism of the Greek debt crisis, and they tap into like the cultural mood of the time. And you notice there's like this distrust or disappointment in authority figures. Many of these movies focus on like the perverse and the absurd, and that's one of the reasons why I really like them. They're transgressive, they're experimental, they experiment with language and the meaning of words. They can be very bleak, but they also have some humor. And many of these depict a dysfunctional family or a relationship where there's a focus on like the abuse of power or a drastic power imbalance. And there's just a general distrust of authority figures, which kind of goes back to the Greeks feeling disappointed in the political system. And these films are, like other new waves, very much about the experience in that country. These are Greek filmmakers, Greek actors, stories about Greek people set in modern day Greece and filmed in Greece. So there's a lot, but a lot of these stories also have some universality about them too.
That's a brilliant introduction to this movement. One of the things that's really interesting to add to that is that some of these directors kind of almost don't like the idea of labeling these films as the weird wave, including Lanthimos. So a quote from him I saw when he was interviewed around the release of Poor Things, he said, "I actually thought that it was a lazy way to label, well, a couple of films in the beginning. There weren't that many films coming out of Greece. All of a sudden, there was this generation of filmmakers that felt they could make films with less money, but I don't think there was a like-minded approach in terms of the creative aspect. Labeling them the Greek weird wave feels quite limiting. I never was very fond of the characterization." So first of all, we'll say apologies, Yorgos, because we're using that label. So sorry if you're listening or watching. But I think that is a bit of a theme with these episodes, that if you look at things like the angry young man writers with the British context, for example, some of them felt it was a very contrived label. I think similar for some of the French New Wave filmmakers. So it's fair to say it's not a movement like the Dogma film movement where there was an explicit manifesto. It's not a film movement where they were kind of, a group of writers who all wrote for the same magazine, like with the French New Wave. But despite what Lanthimos is saying, and like you have said, Raquel, there are recurring characteristics across a range of films. There are some close ties between some of the filmmakers. So Lanthimos appears as an actor in Zangari's film Attenberg, for example. He's also a co-producer. She's a co-producer on some of his films and things like that. So I think there's more of a kind of group thing going on, perhaps, than he sort of recognizes there in a way. This is the moment where I try to explain the film Dogtooth, and
you can do it.
I can do it. We're talking about Dogtooth, and this is an early film by Yorgos Lanthimos. Just quickly on him, he's of course been asked about, did he grow up considering the idea of becoming a filmmaker? And what he has said is that, in Greece at that time, very few films were being made. So the idea of growing up and saying you're going to be a film director would have been quite a strange one or an absurd idea. No real industry, financing being extremely difficult. he saw himself as someone who would make commercials to make his living. And what happened was that making commercials meant he had the money to finance these early films. Now, with Dogtooth, it's a very notable film for many reasons, but it's worth saying that it was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. It won the Uncertain Regard Prize at Cannes and has had other accolades as well. At this point, I'll give a spoiler warning. If you haven't seen Dogtooth and you want to, now's the time to pause the podcast and then get your mind blown away by the film and come back to us. So proceed with caution, because obviously we'll get into some detail. So I would say, Raquel, that Dogtooth is a film where the general setup is messed up enough to begin with, and then the film gets more and more messed up as it goes on. As you actually watch the film, it takes a while, I think, to work out exactly what is happening. But in essence, there's a family of 5, 2 parents, 3 children, 1 son and 2 daughters. They live in a big house that is fenced off from the outside world. The film begins with the children listening to this tape recording, which is giving them the meaning of new words. So these words are being defined for them. And they're common words like sea, motorway, excursion, carbine, but the meanings that these words are given aren't right. So they're told a sea is a leather armchair with wooden arms. And that's the first indication, really, that these characters don't actually know anything about the world outside this house beyond what their parents allow them to know. And a lot of that is frequently misleading. Later in the film, but it's worth mentioning here, we find out that the kids have been told, and I say kids, but I'm not sure what their exact age is, whether they're high teens, early 20s. It's never explicitly stated. But anyway, the children have been told they'll only be ready to leave the house once they've lost a dog tooth, the canine tooth. Mm-hmm. So they're told that the outside world is very dangerous, and the parents find these ways to kind of exaggerate the threats outside the house, which I'm sure we'll come on to. The father does leave the house. He appears to be a factory manager. Every so often, he brings a security guard called Christina back to the house. He gives her a blindfold. She comes in his car with him. And the purpose is that she has sex with the son. This causes complications because Christina realizes, it seems, that she has a certain level of power over the children in this situation. And she begins to kind of barter with the eldest daughter for sexual favors. So she's trading things like a hairband and later on videotapes. So as the film continues, I guess what I can say is we sort of see the after effects of the way she disrupts the plan of the parents. And yeah, we'll get into that. But Raquel, that's actually quite a sanitized description, I think.
That is. I'm impressed.
Of some of the things that are going on. But what would you say about this film then? What are your general thoughts on Dogtooth?
I have a very distinct memory of when I first watched this movie. I had the streaming service, which is now defunct, unfortunately, called Filmstruck. And I credit that service with really exposing me even further to world cinema. And there was this wonderful introduction by Alicia Malone. And she was, it was just a couple minutes of her talking about the movie. And I was like, I need to watch this. This sounds so bizarre. And it blew me away. I was very intrigued by it. I loved how bold it was. And in general, I really love provocative movies, and this really fit that. And this movie isn't just weird and disturbing, it's also compelling. I like how it's sort of like a quilt of scenes. There's like a linear plot, but it's almost like the sequences are sewn together. That's how I like to think of it. And it's almost like you're attacking the story from different perspectives and angles, even though there's not like different POVs. It just feels like it's approaching it at different angles. And I thought that was really interesting. And it's one of those movies you have to just let yourself go along for the ride because you don't know where it's taking you because there's a lot of surprises. And part of the reason why I liked it is, I was raised with strict parents and I endured some level of oppression. In my case, it was religious oppression. So I got sort of a twisted pleasure in seeing like a very extreme and dark depiction of that on screen. And I also like how this movie just for me, it punched me in the gut. Like, it's one of those movies you either leave behind and try to forget about it and never watch it again, or it's one that haunts you. And it haunted me because I was just really intrigued by it. Then I started this deep dive. I wanted to watch more Greek Weird Wave movies. I and it also kickstarted my love of Yorgos Lanthimos. I've seen every single one of his feature films except for his first one, and I've been a devoted fan ever since. I just really, really love his work.
Very good film, I think, and in a way that I can imagine frustrating some viewers, but I think some of the things that some people might find frustrating actually make me want to return to it to try and get more of a grasp of it, get more of a handle on it, because it's shocking and it's provocative, but not in a way that's completely unremitting. Like the tone actually varies quite a bit, doesn't it? And there's a lot of strange, absurd humor. I think it's a great example of what Lanthimos can do, and it's definitely a highlight of the Weird Wave, I think. Just as kind of a follow-up to that introduction to the film, I suppose people might be wondering, like, is this inspired by the filmmaker's own background or upbringing? And the truth is that his own upbringing was very different. His mother died when he was 17, and he said that, you know, she was already separated from his father, so he was kind of on his own from that point, from an early age, and he found that quite freeing because it meant that he wasn't being pressured to be like a doctor or a lawyer or, you know, something like that. He tried to study economics, but he decided it wasn't for him, and he felt free from that kind of pressure. He said, "Life is short. I learned that lesson. It can end at any time. I'd better do something I'm more interested in." So his childhood was not like the depiction we see in the film here. The inspiration for Dogtooth is really interesting. What he said was he had a conversation with some friends, and he was kind of making fun of the fact that a couple of them were getting married and having children. He was sort of saying lots of people get divorced these days, and kids end up being raised by single parents. So he's kind of saying there's no point in getting married, and then he's just joking, but he finds that his friends get extremely defensive about it. And it made him realize how people he never would have expected to react in that way actually became, you know, quite upset when you mess with this idea of the family. And he said that kind of sparked the initial idea about a man who would go to real extremes to protect the family. So I thought that was interesting, and I can kind of relate to some of what he's saying, I think. Yeah, because I think back to my own life, and I remember lots of friends of mine who, when they were younger, weren't interested in getting married, and then people get older and people settle down, people do conventional things, and you know, I've taken that route, and there's something about the idea of the family, and it seems like that idea is particularly strong in Greece and touches a few buttons, and I think it's not just this film in the Weird Wave that kind of shows that. We'll talk about some more later, I'm sure.
That's really interesting because I know both sides, either like childless, unmarried adults, and then also married adults with children, kind of think the other side is part of like a cult. Like they've drunk the Kool-Aid and kind of fallen for this lifestyle and are trying to, you know, like in one side convince the other that that's not the lifestyle that should be had, and the other side maybe like, hey, come over to my side. So I could definitely see that because there are some sort of like cult aspects in how like the father arranges this sort of world for his family.
Yeah, definitely. Just on in terms of the inspiration and the background, the other thing I wanted to mention was that when the film came out, it's 2009, and I don't know if you remember, Raquel, the Joseph Fritzl story from Austria from 2008. So I don't know if that was big news where you were, but it was basically about this guy who kept his daughter in the basement and kind of raised her like in captivity, had children with her. And I think when Dogtooth came out, Lanthimos was asked about, was this an influence? And he said, you know, we were working on the story already. We were already rehearsing the film. That's when the Joseph Fritzl news broke. And what he said that was very interesting actually was this, you know, the Fritzl thing felt very different from what they were trying to do with the movie, because that whole story just had a dark, dreadful tone all the way through. And of course, this film, although it's twisted and disturbing, it's not entirely dark and dreadful because there's humor throughout it. So, Raquel, I was kind of wondering what you think about we call this the weird wave. This is definitely a weird film. What are the things that stand out as being like particularly like weird and striking to you here? What are the first things you think of?
It fits in the Greek weird wave because it has that sense of like a distrust of authority. And to me,
Yeah,
in my mind, if I'm gonna like put everything in symbolism, like the father is sort of like a corporation and his family are sort of the employees under his control, and Christina, who's like the only one with a name, none of the other characters have names, it's just father, mother, eldest daughter, youngest daughter,
yeah,
and son. She's almost like the government who comes in, takes what she wants, sort of like, but doesn't really help anybody. So I think this is like a weird way of sort of representing this sort of power imbalance that's happening. And just like going back to what I was talking about it being sort of like a quilt of scenes. I just love how there's these shocking scenes and you just jump to something else and put all together, you get this sort of weird experience where you just almost like you're floating on a river going from like one bizarre moment to another, and collectively it's just so interesting and shocking.
one of the things that really stood out to me about this film as quite strange is I think there's a real ambiguity around like the backstory here and like what
Mm.
exactly are the motivations of the parents. And it's interesting reading interviews with Lanthimos where he says the father really does have their best intentions at heart. And it's never quite clear in the film, I didn't think, exactly why they're doing this. So I think some of
Yes.
it's implicit, but I think a viewer watching this for the first time might really struggle to understand like what the parents are doing here and why they're doing it. Um, but that's very purposeful. Lanthimos said it was important to him to not spoon feed too much to the audience because
Right.
then it would all become about judging the parents and is it right that they're doing this or wrong? Whereas it actually holds you in a different kind of space, I think, because you don't really know how to chalk up their motivations really. Um,
Yeah, there is no
but
backstory, but all you learn really along the way is all the methods that he uses to control the
yeah.
children. That's really what's revealed. But yeah, you don't really know how this started or anything prior to the very start of the movie. You have no knowledge.
Yeah, it's all very mysterious. Um, there's a great quote from Lanthimos where he said, "I hope my film provokes reactions from people." And yeah, I think it definitely is provocative. And I suppose one obvious factor there is like the way it handles sex. And there's a lot of
Mhm.
sex in this film. And strangely, the back cover of my Dogtooth DVD says the film is shocking, compelling, and perversely erotic. And I think it is shocking. I think it's definitely compelling. I'm not sure I found it that erotic. Definitely
No.
perverse. Definitely perverse. Yeah, I'll give them that. But there's a lot, isn't there? There's sex between Christina and the son. There's quite like rote mechanical sex between the mother and the father. When it's quite a strange scene where they're wearing headphones. There's Christina. This is where we get the unsanitized description from me, but I kind of was dancing around earlier. So she coerces the eldest daughter into going down on her, let's say. And the brother is later told to select one of his sisters to have sex with after
Yeah.
Christina has been taken out of the picture. And I don't know, it all goes back to the theme of like power and control, I guess, doesn't it?
Right.
Because it's like Christina has come in and realized what power she can wield in this situation. And she moves on from the brother to the daughter. I suppose the daughter's able to reverse it a bit, isn't she? Because she starts to be like, well, do you know what dad will do if he finds out I lick your keyboard? And that's what we haven't mentioned is they have substitute words, don't they? So keyboard,
Yeah.
okay. Um, I don't know. It's very interesting, isn't it, how sex is used in this film as part of this power struggle, I suppose,
Yeah, it's
in
an
very interesting ways.
exchange. It's not
Yeah.
erotic at all. Like the Christina's brought in, she's paid, she's blindfolded, so she doesn't even know where she's going, so she can't really help them. This is just a business arrangement to kind of solve a problem, which the assumption is that the son has sexual urges and needs those fulfilled, and this is an arrangement that could take care of that. And then with the eldest daughter, the sexual favors are in exchange for something from the outside. because
Yeah.
I mean, because she doesn't really have access to the outside. So yeah, like the eroticism is completely taken out of it. It's almost just business arrangements and, like you said, just this exchange of like control.
Yeah. And also, it's kind of interesting. You were talking about these films as allegories and, the social
Mhm.
commentary in these films. And you kind of see the double standards there in relation to how the son's sexuality is treated and the daughter's, don't you? Because he gets Christina brought to him. The daughters don't appear to have had
They don't
anyone.
get anybody.
They don't. Yeah, they don't get anybody, and of course that's done for a reason by Lanthimos, and he's talked about how it's about the fact that culturally, boys are seen as much more deserving of having sex, is how he put it, and entitled to
Yeah.
more things than girls are, and so the parents have this kind of conservative approach to sexuality in that sense, and they just don't seem to think about the daughters in that way. And he's talked about how that's the mentality in Greece, and it's quite a dated mentality. But I think it's more wide than that. I think it's actually something that happens in a lot of countries that, yeah, burgeoning sexuality is treated differently for boys than it is for girls. So just an interesting example, I think, about how, although it's within a particularly strange narrative, you can sort of read it as being something wider, something truthful more widely, I think.
I know there's
Um,
just a universality about this, even though it's completely strange and none of us would be in this situation, but there's still some of those like major themes that we can take out. And in this case, that sort of like, built-in misogyny of like the man needs to be taken care of, but the women could be neglected.
and I suppose another really provocative element and a really strange element is the violence. I don't know how you felt, but I think when the violence kind of flares up in this movie, it's really quite shocking and at times tough to watch. So there's
Mm,
a scene where the elder daughter cuts the son with a knife very
yeah.
suddenly. There's a scene where the father, uses the VCR tape as a weapon. So
That's
again,
horrifying. That is
yeah,
really tough to watch.
yeah. And I suppose like the physical violence can be shocking, but it's like deeper than that. There's a lot of psychological violence too.
Yeah.
And it occurs through, some of the things like the language games and the challenges, and all goes back to the idea of the dysfunction within the family. But no, I found the violence very tough to watch actually in a few occasions, to be honest. I
I
suppose it's a
agree.
weird film visually as well, isn't it? Like it's kind of a deadpan visual style in a lot of ways, like lots of long shots, lots of shots for the film with a static camera, but also lots of weird framings, aren't there? Like sometimes you see there'll be a conversation or something, and you'll only see like the lower parts of the bodies of the people who are
Yes,
talking, and
that is a Lanthimos touch that you can see in his later movies. What
yeah,
comes to mind is Kinds of Kindness, because there are several shots like with Jesse Plemons, one of his three characters, having conversations with his wife, and you can only see sort of their lower part. And there's another scene in that movie where Jesse Plemons is trying to stalk Willem Dafoe, and he's in a parking garage, and like the structure is blocking off his face. It's just like, I think that's a really interesting way of like disrupting the scene, because
yeah,
with Dogtooth, when the two sisters are maybe like on the bed talking and you can only see them from like the shoulders down, it's almost like you
yeah.
want to move the camera upwards to see
Yeah,
them.
definitely. Yeah, no, it just adds to that feeling of strangeness. It adds to the feeling of,
Yeah.
in this particular film, it's a very enclosed story, and that kind of adds to that. Just the sense of things not being quite right. So there's the visual
Yes.
style. What about the acting as well? Like, there's this kind of like deadpan approach to the acting too, isn't there? So you get like lines like with a very flat delivery, like burgers is one of my favorite meals. You get this kind of strange, straight laced delivery, don't you? And that's
Yes.
quite characteristic of these films too, isn't it? I think that there's a kind of strange approach to dialogue.
I agree. Like there's this sort of emotionlessness, like almost like these conversations, even though they have meaning, there's a meaninglessness about them. And just to like also point out other Lanthimos films, the film when he started making movies in Hollywood, comes to mind like The Lobster and The Killing of a Sacred Deer, Which those are really interesting movies because the dialogue is delivered almost monotone, especially the killing of a sacred deer. And it's like this emotionless delivery of dialogue, which conflicts with what's happening in the story. In Lobster, these people have to get married, or otherwise they'll be transformed into animals for the rest of their lives. So there's some high stakes. In the killing of a sacred deer, you have this father who has to, in this weird bargain, has to kill one of his family members. So the stakes, the emotional stakes are really, really high, but the delivery is so flat. And I love that contrast. And you see
Yeah.
that in Dogtooth, but you also see it in other movies in the Greek Weird Wave, sort of like this sort of monotone, just kind of flat delivery that kind of works well because it just contrasts with what's happening.
Been really interested to read some interviews with Lanthimos in preparation for this, and he's talked about it as like he likes to keep the film open, and doing so allows people to get engaged in their own kind of way. So I think here, we talked about new Iranian cinema in the last episode, and sometimes there you get these non-actors who are kind of giving these de-dramatized performances. But here it's very different because it's all tied up with absurdity. And as Raquel was saying earlier, like absurdity in the weird wave, a good way to read it is that it's a kind of expression of unease about the insecurity of Greece during the financial crisis. And yeah, I think that level of absurd humor is very important to the film as a whole. What Lanthimos says was, by employing a certain sense of humor, you essentially get more serious about things and show conflict more effectively than if you were overly dramatic or only violent. And I think he is right about that. So you do get strangely comic moments all through the film, don't you? Like there's like a dinner table scene where they start talking about the different supplies that they need, and the son makes this joke about, well, I can't use blue tint for my eyebrows because that would be unnatural, and they start laughing, and I don't know, it just makes you think about actually the whole thing is strange, like the whole concept of what is unnatural in this context. Like they don't know anything about what's natural or unnatural beyond the bounds of that house,
Right.
or when they're asking, the daughter asks for the telephone and the mother passes over the salt shaker, and it's quite funny, but
Yes, there's a
I
lot of
don't know.
language play, like the scene where the parents leave the porn tape on top of the television, I think it is, and the eldest daughter finds it and she asks about a certain word that's on the cover, and the mom gives her a completely different definition of what it is. And
Yeah.
that's just like this weird control that the parents have over the children, but also like it adds those little moments of humor because okay, that's a word, that's not what it means. And it just adds to it. And one thing I was thinking of too is Athena Rachel Sangari said that a lot of these movies live on the edge of realism, and I think there's
Mm.
something really interesting of the fact that they feel real because they are not employing like any sort of like CGI or anything like that, and they're in the real world, but there's something so unreal about them. They're very surreal in how they work.
It's very true. Like there are certain aspects of them that you could almost mistake for being like documentary like filmmaking,
Yes.
and yet it's very far from that in other ways. And you're talking about like the control of the parents, and I suppose another example would be when they announce that in a few months your mother will give birth to two children and a dog. Again, like the instinct is to laugh, and again it makes you think because you start to realize just how twisted this whole setup is and how stifling that family arrangement is for these
One
characters.
moment that always makes me laugh is when the father is bringing bottles of water home and he stops by the
Yeah,
side of the road and he removes all of the labels because them reading the labels would give them some sort of insight into the
yeah.
outside world. And there's something so kind of funny. I mean, it's sad because this is like another little moment of control, but there's also something really funny about that's like the lengths he's going to, and it's really just bizarre.
Yeah. And he must spend a lot of time doing stuff like that. If they've done a full grocery shop or something, it's crazy. Raquel, we'll take a break in a minute, but is there anything else you wanted to say about Dogtooth before we do so?
No, I'm excited to get into the key moments.
Yeah, so let's do that then. Let's take a break. We'll come back and we'll do some key moments and some broader stuff around Dogtooth. Okay, welcome back everybody to CineHistorians. We are still talking about the Greek weird wave, and we are still talking about Dogtooth. And we're going to get into some key moments that we have selected from the movie. And Raquel, I'll throw it over to you first. What do you want to highlight from this film?
I wanted to highlight the endurance games because I think they're very interesting. And like you had mentioned before, these kind of add that level of violence to the story. And I've always come away from the interpretation of this as like there's this level of boredom in the household because they're trapped on this compound. They have very limited access to things like they can only watch home movies. They really don't know what's happening in the outside world. So the level of boredom is really, really high. So one of the things that like we see in the very, very beginning is that they have these endurance games with each other. The youngest daughter comes up with this one of like putting your finger underneath the tap of like really
Yes.
hot water, and whoever can make it the longest wins. Also like other challenges like they hold their breath underwater. That's something that the adults make them do. They're blindfolded and there's a timer set and they have to make their way back to the house. And there's one scene that I can feel when I watch it is when the son is forced to hold Listerine in his mouth.
Oh,
And
yeah.
the face he's making looks like he's going to be in tears. And it's for like a painful amount of time. And this is like a combination of like the adults setting these challenges for the children as a form of control, but then like the siblings end up making their own challenges as a form of entertainment. And it really shows you how confined they are and how there is like this severe lack of social interaction. So, like when Christina comes in, it's really interesting because then they have some sort of entertainment with her because she's a new person in this space. I think this also speaks to how a system of control that's
Mm.
a little too far reaching has like disastrous effects. And that's sort of the interpretation in this movie. And like you had mentioned before, the father and mother tell these stories like, oh, we're gonna have twins, or oh, there's like these things happening in the outside world we have to protect you from. And that's just
Mm.
another like form of
Yeah.
control.
Yeah, like a good example would be when the father dumps the fish in the pool.
Yes, and they
And
have to
it's
like
kind of
hunt
like,
them, or yeah.
yeah, it kind of creates these crises that he can resolve. He can jump in and show how
Yes.
dominant he is. And
Oh,
yeah,
that's a good point.
wow.
Yes. He's the hero in
um,
that circumstance.
he's the hero in his own narrative. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk about the killing of the cat and some of the aftermath of that. And to just to describe it, so what happens is that the son sees a cat in the garden. The daughters are inside. They look quite scared. The son gets these, like, I guess they're garden shears or something, and he advances slowly on the cat and then attacks it suddenly and kills it. And it's brutal, isn't it? Because we see a really bloody shot of the dead cat not long after that. Um,
But the real cat is okay.
yeah, the real cat is fine. Yeah. What happens in the story though is that the parents decide to kind of improvise off the back of that. So you see a scene you see some interesting scenes with the dad outside the house, don't you? Like you said, with the removing the labels, but there's also one here where he's cutting up his trousers and he's covering himself in, what is supposedly blood. And he
Right.
tells them, well, one thing we forgot to mention in all the weirdness is another weird factor is there's an imaginary brother on the other side on the other side of the fence that they kind of throw things to and whatever.
It's getting
But
weird.
but then what happens is the dad says, "Look, your brother is dead. A creature like the one in the garden tore him apart." So they use the death of the cat as a way to kind of change the story. And I just think it's a standout because it kind of captures the absurdity as well as the horror of the film, and it
Yeah.
shows you the role of storytelling within the story within the film as a means of control. And it's kind of funny in its own way too, because the dad teaches them to bark to like defend
Oh
against other
gosh,
cats.
yes.
And there's a very funny reference back to the cat story later on where one of the daughters has attacked the son, and he says, "Look, she hit my leg with a hammer, and the daughter says, actually, no, a cat with a hammer jumped in the window and did it. So I don't know. It's just very strange. Like I say, I think it kind of epitomizes some of what this film is doing. Very strange, very absurd, very horrific, and also funny.
Well, one thing I like about that scene with the killing of the cat, I mean, obviously it's very horrifying, but I like the use of audio because you see him with the shears and he's coming for the cat, and then you see the cat after, but you hear the cat scream, and then the two sisters are in the house screaming in their reaction, and that makes it all the more shocking, I think. I mean, it still would be shocking if it was also kind of silent, you only heard the cat, but something about the sister screaming always surprises me and kind of shocks me. And I just think that that scene is very brilliantly done. Is probably one of, when I talk to people about this movie, it's probably the most memorable scene in the movie.
It absolutely is a memorable scene for sure. And Raquel, you wanted to talk, I think, about some of the movie references within this film. So it's a very closed off like world, but
Yes.
some other movie references do creep in, don't they?
Yeah, I love that the catalyst of the change that happens in the very end of the movie starts with movies. And it's like you had mentioned before, there's the exchange between Christina and the eldest daughter, and Christina offered her a sparkly headband, and the eldest daughter's like, no, that wasn't sparkly enough. If you want me to lick your keyboard, you need to give me something different. So she goes into Christina's bag and she finds these two VHS tapes, and the suggestion is that there's Hollywood movies on it, and we don't see any label. We don't know exactly what's on it. But then there's these scenes after that are really interesting. And that's how we find out what movies were on the tapes. So in one scene, you have the eldest daughter in front of a mirror and she's reenacting scenes from Rocky. And the suggestion is that it's from Rocky 4. And she's like punching herself and she's like spouting lines from the movie. In another scene, she's in the pool with her siblings and she's pretending to be a shark and she's saying lines from Jaws. And then my favorite one is the scene in the anniversary party. So the siblings are throwing an anniversary party for their parents, and the two daughters are performing a dance, and they very much look like the girls from The Shining, like how they're positioned. But so they're doing this little dance, and then the eldest daughter sort of breaks away and goes into this like amazing interpretive dance version of the famous audition scene from Flashdance. She does the spins and the pointing and the kicks, and she tries to do the breakdancing moves. And I love that. One thing I think is really interesting about that is that because they're so closed off from the outside world, the eldest daughter getting some access to what's happening on the outside, even if it's these fictional movies, is like a catalyst for change. And that's then we start to understand why the father was so controlling, because as soon as they can figure out like there's other stuff going on, he'll lose control of them. And like you said, there's that scene with the VHS tape where he tapes it and he hits Christina for doing this. That's brutal. That's one of the most brutal scenes in the movie.
Absolutely brutal, yeah. And I think actually discussing those scenes with the movie references leads me on to discuss the closing scenes when the elder daughter kind of stages an escape. So firstly, I think open endings are a bit of a weird wave characteristic. So this is a good example. There's another, I think the most horrific scene in the film, the one that made me flinch the most, definitely, where the daughter's got this weight in her hand and she kind of hits herself with it, doesn't she, to try and knock the Dogtooth out. And I don't know about you, Raquel, but that was tough to watch, I thought.
I always like cover my face, even though they don't really show it. You just see like the aftermath,
the
right?
Sound as well. The sound is horrific. And anyway, tough to watch. So she leaves the house. It's nighttime. She hides in the back of the car, what I would call the boot of the car, what Raquel would probably call the trunk of the car, I guess.
You can call it the boot of the car.
What happens is the father realizes she's gone and he seems to assume that she's escaped because he doesn't look in the boot of the car. And then it's the next day. He drives to the factory. He goes inside. We see this shot of the car where the eldest is still presumably inside. It's held for a long time. Then the film cuts to black, and then it's a few seconds then before the credits roll. So Yeah, it's in no way like a triumphant escape or a triumphant ending. She's still confined. It's only now she's confined by the car rather than the house. And it makes you wonder what next, I think. Like, we might
Yeah.
have wished for a really fulfilling ending where everybody gets out of that house, but that's not what we get here. We don't know if she's going to be able to escape. And even if she does, like, I think the kind of psychological adjustment you would have to make after a life like that is kind of mind-boggling to contemplate. So I don't know. How do you take the ending, Raquel? How do you read it?
It's very bleak and unsettling because, yeah, is she just trapped in the trunk? Will she ever be found? Is she still alive? Is she bleeding from her mouth?
Yep.
And if she does escape the trunk, will he just find her really quickly and bring her back
Yep.
home? Does that mean when she gets a taste of the outside that there'll be sort of a rebellion amongst the siblings to get out? She can kind of inform them of this outside world. There's so many possibilities, although I just like to think that she got out and she's safe somewhere.
Yeah, but again, we don't know. We don't get that reassurance, do we?
No.
So it's a like I say, it's a good example of how there's a level of uneasiness and ambiguity around endings in the weird
Yes.
wave quite often. Um, all right, so we get now to the section of the podcast that we call Any Other Business, where we look at some other things that interest us that are linked to Dogtooth. The first one I wanted to highlight were comparisons between this film and some other stories. So there are three that I wanted to touch on. The first one is a film called The Castle of Purity, which it seems like there are, commentators on the internet who've really latched onto this and pointed out that there's a close tie between The Castle of Purity, which is a Mexican film from the 1970s, and this later film by Lanthimos, Dogtooth. So there definitely is a lot of similarity in the premise because it's another film where there's kind of a domineering father who insists that the family stays secluded from the outside world. There are other scenes that are somewhat equivalent, like there's a scene where the children are playing blindfolded, which also
Mm.
happens in Dogtooth. But I think there are a lot of differences. Like the tone of that Mexican film is very different. The father is much more explicitly like tyrannical, and he's kind of misanthropic. He hates the rest of humanity. He calls people rats and things like that. So apparently, Lanthimos has never acknowledged the Castle of Purity as a potential source for Dogtooth, but it's worth noting that because Dogtooth was a high-profile film, this earlier film then got a release in Greece a couple of years later in 2011. So kind of helped to make sure this older film got seen more widely, which I think is good. Um, I know you've had a look at the Castle of Purity too, Raquel. Do you agree with me that the similarities are there, but they're not as strong as some people online seem to think? Was that your impression?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest difference is the fact that these children are children in the Castle of Purity, whereas in Dogtooth, they're young adults. There's this, you know, ex- they're at the point where the control of the parents doesn't make much sense because they should be leaving the nest and living their own lives. Whereas in the Castle of Purity, they're minors. So I think that's like a really stark difference. And also, isn't there like a big theme about rat poison? Him developing
Yeah,
rat poison and selling it, and that seems to be a storyline where it's kind of vague in Dogtooth where what the father does. We know he's a manager at like
yeah,
sort of a factory, but um it's not as, I mean, those to me are like the two biggest differences, but I can also see the similarity of how he traps his family. He tells them that
yeah.
the outside world is bad. And
The other film I wanted to mention that Dogtooth made me think of, and I'm not sure if maybe other people have made this comparison. I'm not sure, but a film from 2004 by M. Night Shyamalan called The Village. And quick spoilers for The Village if anyone hasn't seen it. It's a film that a lot of people didn't like at the time, but I've always been quite fond of it. And it concerns a community in what appears to be the 19th century, and they all avoid leaving the village because there's a monster supposedly in the woods. And this is where the spoilers come in. What we learn is that the monster is only a creation. The founders of the village are all people who've experienced extreme grief and they've decided to isolate themselves from society. So we're not really in the 19th century at all. They've created this old fashioned village in the modern day. And a lot of people don't like the twist in the story, felt it was too obvious. And Shyamalan had become associated with twist endings after The Sixth Sense and Unbreakable, and this was a point where people started to get a bit fed up with it, I think. But one of the reasons it's a really fascinating film is that you can read it as a story that's dealing with post 9/11 themes, actually not that long after 9/11, because ideas about creating external things to be scared of, ideas about the perils of isolationism. So the context in Dogtooth is quite different, but some of those aspects are quite similar, and they come into play in the Lanthimos film. So just wanted to mention that quickly. I also wanted to point out that some of the ideas in Dogtooth, people say, well, maybe it's ripping off this Mexican film from the 70s or whatever, but the ideas can actually be traced back quite a long time. And I wanted to mention a story that Plato used called The Allegory of the Cave. And hopefully, if you're with us on YouTube, we can put up like an illustration of The Allegory of the Cave as a bit of a visual aid. But this was a story presented in Plato's Republic as a dialogue between Plato's brother and his mentor, Socrates. So in simple terms, imagine a cave in which there are some people who've been chained up since they were children. They don't know the outside world. And in this cave, people carry various objects that look like things. And this happens in front of a fire. So the fire casts these shadows onto the wall in front of the prisoners. And these are shadows that look like a horse or they look like a bird. So the prisoners who are chained up believe that the things they see are real because they've got no experience of these things in reality. They've never seen a horse, they've never seen a bird. So they think these shadows are a real representation. And it just shows how this idea of prisoners with limited experience of reality goes back a long way. And it's relevant to not just Dogtooth, but lots of later films too, like The Truman Show or The Matrix. Yeah. And Plato's kind of making a point that he's using this story of the cave to say that this is similar to the way we see the real world around us. Because he has this idea that there's this very spiritual realm where there's a perfect version of everything. So the gods have created a perfect horse in this realm of forms. And all the horses we see in the real world are just copies of the perfect horse that gods have created. So what he kind of is saying is that the task of the philosopher is to try to escape from the cave, escape from this world of copies, and try to perceive reality. It was a very influential idea because he basically says that art is a copy of a copy. The real world is made up of copies, and is part of the reason why artists were seen for a long time as imitators. Yeah. And that idea held sway for a long time until the age of the Romantics, when it began to be challenged. So just basically, I think there are some obvious comparison points between Dogtooth and The Allegory of the Cave. And therefore, I think some of that internet fixation with The Castle of Purity and then Dogtooth as the later film being maybe like a ripoff or a remake of it, I think there's a wider point here that actually some of these ideas in Dogtooth, we can trace them all the way back to the ancient Greeks, if not possibly before Plato, if we really looked into it. So just wanted to quickly mention that. Yeah. It shows how this film, which it's very strange, it's very absurd, it leaves you thinking, it gets you thinking, I think, about other things. It also shows how these ideas kind of circulate and transform as well in very different contexts in quite an interesting way. So Raquel, like you said, Yorgos Lanthimos, one of your favorites, and I think you wanted to talk more broadly about him, is that right? And his later films?
I like to compare Dogtooth with Poor Things. And the reason is because they have sort of this similarity thematically. In both like Dogtooth and Poor Things, you have a young adult who's experiencing this sort of disconnect between their adult bodily urges and their childlike mind. Because in Dogtooth, these young adults are deprived of knowledge and are now grappling, in the case of the son, with sexual urges, in the case of the daughters, sexual expectations, and then also their own sort of like curiosity about this that they don't really understand. In Poor Things, Emma Stone plays this young woman who is pregnant and she commits suicide, and Willem Dafoe is like this sort of mad scientist, lovable mad scientist, but mad scientist who comes in, and in this scene, it's very Metropolis, very Frankenstein. revives her by implanting the baby's brain in her head. So out of this comes this new version of this character who has these bodily these urges because she's in an adult body, but her brain hasn't caught up. And that discrepancy to me is really fascinating. And you can sort of draw parallels too with the fact that the mad scientist in Poor Things, although he is a little more lovable and charming and he cares about her, is also trying to force some sort of control. Like she decided to end her life and he is taking that decision away from her. And in Dogtooth, you have the father, basically controlling the children and with extreme methods. So I think that's really interesting. And like I was talking about before, how there's some interesting use of framing, like you had mentioned about the framing of like the characters, like you can't see their head and shoulders. And I like that that's kind of reused in Kinds of Kindness. And once you start watching all of Lanthimos's films, you start drawing those connections. And in Kinds of Kindness, it's really interesting because there's even more disruption to me, like that sort of scene where you can't see, like the characters are talking, but you can't see their heads. That's like a form of visual disruption. And in Kinds of Kindness, you have even more. Like there's this scene where there's weird editing transitions and you move on to the next shot before you're ready. And there's this sort of unsettling nature about that. And there's also use of intrusive sound, like these dings, and there's also like this phone ringing. And like you said, Lanthimos wants to kind of shock the audience or kind of get a reaction out of it. And I feel like Dogtooth is like a great example of how that starts. And then you can sort of see the parallels in other movies. And if anyone hasn't seen like other Lanthimos films, definitely watch The Lobster and The Killing of a Sacred Deer, because I think they are just really interesting, like I had mentioned before, and how you have like this monotone delivery of dialogue, but then this complexity of stories. And I like how that goes back to the edges of realism, like this is looks real, but it's definitely not real. There's something fantastical about it.
Two things I wanted to ask you quickly off the back of that, I think, that are really interesting to me. Do you think there's a bit of a shift? Like you say, there are all these common factors we can point out in his films. But do you think there's a bit of a shift in the style visually where it seems like in the later films you get a lot of like distorted camera lenses, you get things like slow motion.
Fisheye lenses, like in The Favorite, yes.
Yeah, whereas that's not really a factor in the likes of Dogtooth and Alps, is it really? I don't think. So
right, we're using more. I mean, the camera's very still, I have to say, in Dogtooth. There's a lot more like tableau shots and just like a very still camera. And in his later work, it's like, you like you said, like the fisheye lens and different angles. And then like with Poor Things, it is like very steampunk, like fantasy. There's like these visual elements, which he doesn't have in his earlier films, possibly because there's no funding for something like that. Now he has the Hollywood funding, but these are very much like, they look real because there's like these limitations in what they could actually do.
Leads me on to the second thing I was going to mention to you, which is that he said how he couldn't properly find funding for Alps after Dogtooth, and so you get a situation where he's moving beyond Greece in a way and making films internationally. And I suppose it's a bit of a theme with some of these new waves, actually, isn't it? Because we've talked about, you could look at the British New Wave and how some of those actors end up in Hollywood films. You could look at the Australian film revival and how somebody like Peter Weir gets lured into American filmmaking. And I don't know, how should we feel about it? And as a Yorgos Lanthimos super fan, who's got a Kinds of Kindness baseball cap in the background there. Like, would you rather he was in a position to make these films in Greece, or do you like the fact that he's become part of the American film industry, or mixed feelings, or how do you find that?
It's tough because in some cases you feel like a lot of these directors, not just Lanthimos, maybe they sold out a bit because Hollywood has more money, bigger budgets, larger pool of talent, lots more technology than he would have had in his home country of Greece. I also feel like that is also his way of just expanding his capabilities and seeing like what would it be like if he had a big budget and all these resources, what he could do. And he's showing that he can really do some very interesting things. But then sometimes you feel sad. Like I love Pedro Almodovar, and he was very strict about making films in Spain in Spanish, and now he's branching off into English language films, and it's, you kind of feel happy for them to like kind of advance, but also sad that they're sort of leaving their home country in order to find, it's almost like they're immigrating to Hollywood to do these other things. So it's mixed feelings, but with Lanthimos, I feel like you can tell like he's kind of kept that absurdity and that perverseness and like that stuff that comes out of the Greek weird wave. He's really held on to that even in his Hollywood phase of his career.
Oh yeah, he's definitely not been swallowed up by the machine in any way. You know, he's maintained his individuality, I think it's fair to say.
His movies are still weird.
They very much are still weird, absolutely. And speaking of weirdness, I think, Raquel, we wanted to talk about some other films quickly from this this movement. So where do you want to start with this?
I have a couple of recommendations. So the first one is a short movie, which you can actually watch on YouTube, and I'll leave the link down below in the show notes and then on the YouTube channel, so you can watch it. It's called Casus Belli. It's from 2010. It's directed by Yorgos Lanthimos, and it's just about 10 minutes long. And what's interesting about this, it very much is probably the closest of the films that I've seen to actually be a response to the debt crisis. And the film is one long camera pan, and you start at a line at the grocery store, and then it's at the nightclub, and then it's at the church, an art gallery, and it keeps going. And it ends at a soup kitchen. And the expectation here is that everyone who's in this queue, once they get to the front of the queue, will get what they have come for. But in that scene where this elderly man, all he wants is some food because he's struggling, gets shut out. There's no food left. And then the film takes a really interesting turn where there's like this crazy domino effect that happens. And basically it's, I don't want to spoil it for you, so definitely watch it and then kind of think about these things. It's like a self-reflective sort of visual study of like the haves and have-nots. The haves are these other people in line. They you see them eventually get what they are waiting in line for, and the have-nots couldn't get what he wanted at the end of this line. And it's interesting because the grocery cart that we see at the beginning of the movie kind of goes rogue. It kind of travels through the city, and it's full of groceries. It's full of what this elderly man needed. And the grocery cart passes the Greek flag, and it also goes down these staircases. And the building in the back, the assumption is it's a government building. So it's very, very distinctly a commentary on the debt crisis. And so if you kind of want to get your feet wet in the Greek weird wave, that's a good one to start with, since it's only 10 minutes of your time. And then my other selection is Pity, which is one of my favorites of the weird wave. It's directed by Babis Makridis, and he co-wrote it with Efthimis Philippou, who is a longtime collaborator of Yorgos Lanthimos, and he also wrote Dogtooth in other films. Like he worked on Kinds of Kindness and Killing of a Sacred Deer. So like I had said before, there's a lot of collaboration. There's like this nice like community of talent here. And I love that this is like one of those high concept movies. It's about this lawyer. He's a family man, and his wife's in a coma. And while he and his son are waiting for the wife to come out of the coma, he's enjoying, like the protagonist is enjoying all the pity he's receiving. Then when the wife comes out of the coma, the pity has disappeared. There's no reason to feel bad for him. And he does not like that. And it takes like this very dark turn. And this also is a very visually stunning movie because the tableau shots in the movie are stunning. But yeah, if you can find this one, I highly recommend it.
Oh, fantastic. I haven't seen either of those because I didn't know the first one was on YouTube, so I can check that out quite easily. And then Pity, I'll have to dig around for, but it sounds really good. I wanted to mention two films that I think you've seen actually, Raquel. So feel free to jump in with any thoughts if you want to. The first one is from 2016 and it's called Suntan, directed by Argyris Padadimitropoulos and starring Makis Papadimitriou. The film's about a doctor who accepts this job on quite a picturesque island. And it's the kind of place that really lives for summer tourism. You know, not much is happening 11 months of the year. And then August is suddenly very busy. And this is like great for the local economy. And what happens is that when summer comes, this doctor becomes obsessed by a young tourist that he meets. And he starts trying to kind of get involved with her group of friends. He becomes a bit of a stalker, it seems, but the group kind of tolerates him for a while. And it seems a bit kind of sad and pathetic in some ways, but as it goes on, things turn more sour. The mood of the film gets darker. I'll just leave it there. But I think it's an interesting film because one of the characteristics of the Weird Wave is that they offer up images of Greece that are different from stereotypical images. Yeah. So they ignore familiar landmarks. So in Dogtooth, there are no references to recognizable landscapes or landmarks. There's no obvious reference to what's in the news or the social context. Right. So if you think about Suntan, you've got this portrayal of life on this kind of tourist haven island. And I suppose a lot of us would have seen films involving Greek islands where they're portrayed as a kind of paradise. So probably the most famous is Mamma Mia, maybe. But you also have, there's a famous film, a British film called Shirley Valentine, where the main character is this Liverpudlian housewife who ends up having a holiday dalliance with a kind of a waiter in Greece. In the James Bond movie For Your Eyes Only, I think part of that is set on a Greek island that's very picturesque. So Suntan is interesting because you get quite a jaundiced look about what what an island being a tourist hotspot actually entails. You know, long periods of boredom, long periods of not many people there, tension between the locals and the tourists. So there's kind of an underlying sadness to the way it depicts that main character and the setting. And that I think is an interesting aspect of the film. Did you find it an interesting film?
Yeah, I like how that explores, like you said, the fact that this is a tourist spot, but then this character lives there and works there. And it's like that strange tension between the locals and the tourists that really have to coexist. And I also got a little bit, I mean, this is like definitely a midlife crisis, but I kind of got Bartleby the Scrivener vibes, the fact that he doesn't want to work anymore. He just wants to enjoy life, and almost like the silent protest of, I'm just not going to do my job very well anymore. And this is very, very niche for anyone who loves Lanthimos films. There's a scene in this movie that I believe is replicated in Kinds of Kindness. It's a scene between Emma Stone and Margaret Qualley. If anyone can point that out to me, you get brownie points because I have not heard anyone make a comparison.
Right. So somebody needs to pop up in our YouTube comments section and do that, don't they? I think. My second recommendation, and we've probably saved the bleakest until last with this one. So this is a film
more than a recommendation, maybe.
Yeah, maybe it is. This is a film from 2013 called Miss Violence, directed by Alexandros Avrana. This is a very, very grim film. It starts with the birthday party of an 11-year-old girl who then jumps off a balcony and kills herself. And of course, we wonder why. We wonder exactly what's going on within her family. As Raquel mentioned, like at the start of this episode, the idea of the sort of turmoil within the family is a characteristic of the Greek Weird Wave. And it is a strange family, it's fair to say. It takes a while to work out exactly what all the dynamics are between the characters, how they all relate to one another. What I'll say is that as the film progresses, some very dark truths emerge. And we realize that it's a family where the patriarch figure is not what he appears to be. Let's leave it at that. But what I wanted to say was, I think, it's a acclaimed film. It won Best Director and Best Actor at the Venice Film Festival. It tackles extremely serious social issues through this weird wave style. Like I said, unrelentingly bleak. So when Yorgos Lanthimos said that the Joseph Fritzl case was way too dark and dreadful compared to what was happening in Dogtooth, he could have been describing the film Miss Violence, I think.
I agree.
And I think that makes it a less interesting film than Dogtooth, because Dogtooth, you actually want to revisit to kind of unpick the strange like blend of tones. And I don't think Miss Violence has that kind of ebb and flow. It's a powerful film, no doubt about it. Did you find it powerful, Raquel, and tough to watch?
Yeah, it left me just destroyed afterwards. I came into it thinking, oh, this is interesting because it sort of reminds me of Virgin Suicides, where you have a daughter at a party commit suicide, and there's this father figure who's also kind of control. Well, I think in Virgin Suicides it's both parents, but it's a very insular family. They're kind of shielded and controlled, and the disruption here is the fact that a young daughter commits suicide, and then you follow the aftermath. And I thought this sounds kind of similar to that, but it is very different. It was very dark. And it is, you can compare it a little bit to Dogtooth, like you had said. Like the other case was very grim, Dogtooth isn't as grim. This one is just unrelenting. And I love this Letterboxd review of this username C Lucas. He says, Miss Violence is a stylish but unrelenting dark film that doesn't achieve much more than ruining the rest of your day. And it does. It ruins the rest of your day.
Yeah. I think it ruined my weekend, to be honest. Just one last point on Miss Violence, though. So we've talked about how important this idea is of these Greek films as being allegories for the wider country. And that's an important part of how these films have been taken outside of Greece as well. This is kind of how we understand a lot of them. But it's worth saying that there are some filmmakers who have kind of pushed back against that a little bit. And the director of this film says that this is not about the Greek crisis. Actually, it was just, he took inspiration from a real story from Germany. So it's just interesting to point out, again, like we said, with Lanthimos not being keen of the idea of the weird wave as a label, and this director pushing back against some of that as well. It's kind of interesting. Yeah. It's fascinating, I think. Okay, Raquel, I guess we're going to gear up to say our goodbyes. And one thing we could do is quickly preview the next episode. So what we can say is that we're going to jump back in time, actually, for the next installment. And the next installment is the first part of a two-part look at the new Hollywood movement. So we thought this would be like a kind of a stylish blockbuster way to round off the season, didn't we, Raquel, basically?
Yeah, we're selling out. We're going to Hollywood.
Do you want to tell people what the film is that we're going to look at in the next episode?
We're looking at The Graduate.
Right. So not quite as not safe for work as Dogtooth, but I think, a few racy moments maybe. It's going to be a lot of fun. I haven't seen The Graduate for a little while, so I'm looking forward to revisiting it. Absolutely. At this stage, then, we're getting ready to say bye, but we should remind listeners, I think, to rate and review the podcast. We would love a 5-star rating. We would love a positive review. If you could leave us one, that would be fantastic. We would also like some subscriptions to our YouTube channel, wouldn't we, Raquel? So what can people do with that button on YouTube?
They could smash it and follow us.
Absolutely. Please do that if you can, listeners and viewers. That would be wonderful. And yeah, we'll say bye now. We hope you've enjoyed this episode on Dogtooth and the Greek Weird Wave. Take care, everybody. Bye now.
Talk to you soon.
You can find the CineHistorians at cinehistorians.com and on X, Letterboxd, and YouTube at CineHistorians.
If you're interested in supporting the show, please consider leaving us a Ko-fi. You can find our Ko-fi link and all of our other links in the show notes. Thank you for listening and happy viewing.